The biggest mistake in business isn't losing money, it's underestimating the person sitting across from you. On a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, people moved through the glass lobby of Collins Technologies with the kind of urgency that came from billion-dollar ambitions and impossible deadlines. Executives hurried toward elevators, assistants balanced tablets and coffee cups, and security guards scanned badges without looking up. In the middle of all that motion, one woman stepped through the revolving doors carrying nothing more than a slim black notebook. Maya Brooks wore a navy blazer, simple slacks, and comfortable shoes. No designer logos. No entourage. No attempt to draw attention. If someone had glanced at her for 2 seconds, they might have assumed she was another consultant, another analyst, maybe even a visitor waiting for directions. That assumption followed her almost immediately. As Maya approached the reception desk, the young man behind it smiled politely before asking which executive she was assisting. Maya returned the smile and calmly gave her name. The receptionist typed for a moment, frowned slightly, then checked the screen again. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion. "You're here for the board meeting?" he asked. Maya nodded. "That's right." He looked as though he wanted to ask another question, but stopped himself. Instead, he handed her a temporary badge and pointed toward a private elevator reserved for senior leadership. Maya thanked him and walked away without another word. The elevator climbed 42 floors above the city. Through the glass walls, Chicago stretched for miles beneath a cloudy sky. Maya stood quietly, reviewing notes she barely needed. Months of research, negotiations, and financial analysis had already brought her to this moment. Yet nobody stepping into that elevator would have guessed how important her presence actually was. When the doors opened, a woman from the executive staff greeted her with a rushed smile and guided her toward the boardroom. Along the way, employees moved aside for vice presidents and department heads, greeting them by name. No one greeted Maya. No one recognized her. No one seemed curious about why she had been invited to one of the most important meetings in company history. Outside the boardroom, framed awards covered the walls. Revenue milestones. Innovation trophies. Magazine covers featuring the company's celebrated CEO, Richard Collins. According to business media, Collins was a visionary leader. Investors admired him. Competitors respected him. Employees followed him. Today, he was preparing to secure what many believed would be the deal that transformed the company forever. Maya paused outside the conference room doors. Voices echoed from inside. Laughter. Confidence. Celebration before victory. She noticed something interesting. Every person entering the room carried an air of certainty, as though the outcome had already been decided. As though the future belonged to them. Maya glanced down at her notebook, then back at the doors. A small smile crossed her face. People often revealed who they really were before they knew who she really was. And in a few minutes, this room would reveal everything. The conference room was already nearly full when Maya stepped inside. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and a polished walnut table stretched nearly 30 feet through the center of the room. Around it sat senior executives, board members, legal advisors, and department heads whose decisions affected thousands of employees across the country. Conversations continued as she entered. Nobody stopped speaking. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody stood to greet her. Maya quietly took an open seat near the middle of the table and placed her notebook in front of her. For a brief moment, she simply observed. Years of experience had taught her that people often revealed their assumptions before revealing their intentions. Less than a minute later, the door opened again. Richard Collins walked into the room surrounded by 2 senior executives. His confidence filled the space before he even spoke. Several people immediately straightened in their seats. Others smiled and nodded. Richard acknowledged them with practiced ease before taking his place at the head of the table. His eyes swept across the room, briefly passing over Maya before moving on as though she were not there. The meeting began. Revenue projections appeared on large screens. Growth forecasts followed. Expansion plans were discussed in detail. Richard spoke frequently, guiding the conversation with the certainty of someone accustomed to being the most important voice in every room. 20 minutes passed before Maya decided to ask a simple question about projected operating costs in a new market. Her question was direct, professional, and relevant. Yet before she could finish speaking, Richard turned toward the chief financial officer. "David, why do not you explain the cost structure?" he said. The chief financial officer answered immediately. Maya was never acknowledged. She remained calm. A few minutes later, another executive raised essentially the same concern Maya had mentioned. This time Richard praised the observation and encouraged discussion. Several people nodded in agreement. Maya noticed the irony but said nothing. The meeting continued. As presentations advanced, Richard repeatedly directed attention toward male executives seated around the table. When Maya attempted to contribute, he redirected the conversation elsewhere. Not aggressively, not openly hostile, just enough to make it clear that her voice carried less weight in his mind than everyone else's. What made the situation unusual was that nobody seemed willing to challenge him. Some executives avoided eye contact. Others appeared uncomfortable but remained silent. One board member glanced toward Maya several times, as though trying to understand why she appeared completely unbothered. Most people in that position would have shown frustration by now. Maya did not. She listened carefully, took notes, and occasionally looked toward the presentation screens. Her composure only deepened the mystery. As the discussion moved toward future financing strategies, Richard became even more confident. He spoke as though approval was inevitable, as though every major stakeholder already agreed with him, as though there were no meaningful obstacles left to overcome. Maya quietly wrote a single sentence inside her notebook. Then she closed it. Across the table, one older board member noticed the movement and studied her expression for a moment. For the first time that morning, someone seemed to recognize that the quietest person in the room might not be the least important. The meeting moved deeper into strategic planning, and with every passing minute Richard seemed increasingly convinced that complete agreement already existed around the table. Charts filled the screens. Forecasts stretched years into the future. Executives discussed market share, acquisitions, and expansion opportunities across multiple regions. Yet beneath the confident presentations, small cracks were beginning to appear. Maya noticed them immediately. Several assumptions in the projections depended on funding arriving exactly when expected. Certain growth targets required aggressive hiring. Entire divisions were preparing for projects that had not actually been approved yet. Richard spoke about these plans as if they were already guaranteed. The confidence impressed some people in the room. It concerned others. During a discussion about risk management, Maya calmly raised her hand. This time she waited until there was complete silence before speaking. "What contingency plan exists if capital deployment is delayed?" she asked. It was a reasonable question. In fact, it was one of the most important questions any serious investor might ask. For a brief second, several executives looked toward her. Before anyone could respond, Richard leaned back in his chair and smiled. "We are not expecting delays," he said. Then he immediately turned toward another executive. "Mark, tell everyone about the expansion timeline." The conversation moved on as though Maya had never spoken. Across the table, the older board member who had been quietly observing throughout the morning narrowed his eyes slightly. He seemed surprised by Richard's response. Maya simply nodded and continued listening. She did not repeat the question. She did not demand attention. She did not show irritation. Her patience was becoming impossible to ignore. As presentations continued, a pattern emerged that even the most distracted attendees could see. Whenever a senior male executive offered an opinion, Richard welcomed the contribution. Whenever Maya attempted to engage, the conversation somehow shifted elsewhere. Nobody openly addressed what was happening, but the atmosphere in the room gradually changed. People began paying attention for reasons unrelated to the presentation. They were watching the interactions. They were noticing who was being heard and who was being overlooked. Then something unusual happened. A vice president standing near the screen accidentally referenced a market analysis report that had guided several key recommendations. The Brooks report was especially valuable, he said. Most of our assumptions came from that framework. Maya remained silent. The vice president continued presenting. Richard never acknowledged the comment. He either failed to connect the name or chose not to. Either way, the moment passed. But not everyone missed it. The older board member glanced at Maya again. Another executive looked down at a document in front of him and then back toward her with visible curiosity. The room was beginning to ask questions Richard had not yet considered. Who is this woman? Why did certain people seem aware of her work? Why did she appear completely unconcerned about being ignored? And perhaps most importantly, why had she received an invitation to one of the most important meetings in company history if she was merely another attendee? While others quietly wondered, Maya looked toward the city skyline beyond the windows. Her expression never changed. She had seen situations like this before. People often revealed their judgment long before they revealed their competence. And the longer Richard continued underestimating her, the more expensive that judgment was about to become. By late morning, the meeting had shifted from projections to execution. The atmosphere in the room grew more serious as conversations moved from ambitious ideas to the practical realities of funding them. Department leaders presented staffing requirements. Operations executives discussed infrastructure costs. Legal advisors outlined regulatory considerations. Every new presentation pointed toward the same conclusion. The company was preparing for a transformation that would require enormous financial support. Richard seemed energized by the momentum. He moved confidently from topic to topic, speaking with the certainty of someone who believed success was already secured. Several executives followed his lead, reinforcing the optimism. Yet Maya noticed something many others missed. The discussions increasingly depended on assumptions rather than guarantees. Numbers were being treated as commitments before they had actually become commitments. During one presentation, a senior operations executive displayed a timeline showing multiple expansion phases scheduled to begin within 6 months. The plan was impressive, but it depended heavily on immediate access to capital. Maya reviewed the figures for a moment before offering another observation. What adjustments have been prepared if deployment occurs in stages rather than all at once? She asked calmly. Once again, the question was reasonable. It reflected the kind of disciplined thinking experienced investors valued. Before the operations executive could answer, Richard spoke first. That scenario is unlikely, he said with a dismissive smile. We are focused on execution, not hypotheticals. A few people chuckled politely. The discussion moved on. Maya simply folded her hands and listened. Across the table, the older board member no longer seemed merely curious. He appeared concerned. He had now watched Richard brush aside several thoughtful questions without serious consideration. More importantly, he had noticed that Maya never reacted emotionally. Most professionals would eventually become defensive or frustrated. Maya did neither. Her calmness made the situation harder to ignore. As another presentation began, a member of the finance team referenced external research supporting the company's expansion strategy. Our strongest validation came from the Brooks Capital analysis, he explained. The framework identified several opportunities competitors completely overlooked. This time, more people noticed the name. A few executives exchanged quick glances. One quietly searched through documents in front of him. Another looked toward Maya and then back at the presentation screen. Connections were beginning to form. Richard, however, remained focused on the presentation. If he recognized the significance of the reference, he gave no indication. The room continued discussing future opportunities, but attention was slowly drifting elsewhere. Curiosity was replacing certainty. Questions were forming beneath the surface. Why had multiple presentations referenced work connected to Brooks Capital? Why did several experienced board members seem increasingly interested in Maya's presence? And why had she remained completely unfazed despite being overlooked throughout the morning? The answers remained hidden, but the mystery was growing stronger with every passing minute. Maya noticed the shifting energy immediately. People were beginning to pay attention. Not because she demanded attention. Not because she introduced herself. Simply because consistency has a way of revealing truth. Meanwhile, Richard continued leading the meeting exactly as before, unaware that the room was gradually changing around him. And with each new dismissal, he was making a judgment that would soon become impossible to reverse. As noon approached, the boardroom settled into a brief pause while presentation materials were updated on the screens. Coffee cups were refilled. Documents were exchanged. Quiet conversations formed around different sections of the table. For the first time all morning, Richard was not speaking. The temporary silence allowed something else to happen. People started observing one another instead of staring at charts. Maya noticed several executives looking her way before quickly looking elsewhere. Curiosity had clearly spread through the room. The questions nobody wanted to ask directly were becoming harder to ignore. One executive leaned toward another and whispered something while glancing at a document packet. A few seats away, the older board member appeared to be reviewing notes with unusual focus. Whatever he was searching for, he seemed close to finding it. Then the next presentation began. The chief strategy officer stood and outlined the company's most ambitious initiative yet, a nationwide expansion requiring significant outside capital. The proposal depended on partnerships, investor confidence, and long-term financial stability. As the presentation progressed, several references appeared on the screen citing research models, market analyses, and risk assessments. More than once, the name Brooks Capital appeared in small print beneath supporting data. This time the references were impossible to miss. A younger executive finally looked directly at Maya, then back at the screen, then back at Maya again. The connection seemed to register. Yet before he could say anything, Richard resumed control of the discussion. "This is exactly why we are positioned to dominate the market," he said confidently. "Everything is aligned." Maya listened carefully. Then she raised a simple question. "Have alternative funding scenarios been evaluated in the event market conditions shift during implementation?" Several heads turned toward her immediately. The room had become conditioned to expect what would happen next. "Sure enough," Richard answered before anyone else could speak. "We are focused on growth," he said, "not on preparing for problems that are unlikely to occur." His tone remained professional, but the dismissal was unmistakable. What surprised Maya was not Richard's response. It was the reaction from everyone else. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody nodded. The room remained quiet for a moment longer than usual. Even people who supported Richard seemed uncomfortable. The pattern had become too obvious to ignore. One board member cleared his throat as if considering whether to speak, then decided against it. Another shifted in his chair and stared at the presentation screen without really looking at it. The atmosphere was changing in subtle ways. Confidence was giving way to uncertainty. Not uncertainty about the business plan, but uncertainty about the judgments being made inside the room. Maya remained completely composed. She made no attempt to challenge Richard. She did not defend herself. She did not seek validation. Instead, she quietly wrote another note in her notebook and closed it once again. Across the table, the older board member finally found whatever he had been looking for. His eyes widened slightly as he studied a page in front of him. Then he looked directly at Maya with an expression that was part surprise and part realization. For the first time all day, someone in the room seemed to understand exactly who had been sitting among them the entire morning. The realization on the older board member's face lasted only a second, but Maya noticed it immediately. Years of experience had taught her how to read a room, and something significant had just changed. The board member lowered the document slightly and looked toward Richard, then back toward Maya. He seemed to be weighing whether to say something. Instead, he remained silent and continued observing. The meeting moved forward, but the rhythm had shifted. What had started as a routine presentation was becoming something else entirely. Questions were forming beneath the surface, and not all of them were about business. A new slide appeared on the screen outlining projected funding milestones. The numbers were enormous. Expansion into multiple states. New facilities. Technology investments. Hiring initiatives. Every major objective depended on securing outside capital. The company had built its future around the assumption that financing would arrive on schedule. Richard stood beside the screen and spoke with unwavering confidence. Once the capital commitment is finalized, execution begins immediately, he said. There is no reason to expect delays. Several executives nodded. Others appeared less certain. Maya listened carefully. What interested her was not the presentation itself. It was the certainty. In business, certainty often revealed more about a person's assumptions than their actual knowledge. As discussion continued, a legal advisor asked a question regarding investor expectations and governance oversight. Before the advisor finished speaking, Richard launched into a lengthy response about alignment, trust, and partnership. Once again, he spoke as though every key stakeholder had already agreed with every major decision. Maya noticed several people exchanging glances. The confidence that had seemed impressive earlier in the morning was beginning to feel premature. Then an executive from corporate development spoke up. We should probably review the investor feedback summary before finalizing the implementation calendar, he said. The suggestion was reasonable. A few heads nodded around the table. Richard dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. We have strong support, he replied. The direction is clear. The room grew quiet. Not because everyone agreed, but because nobody seemed eager to challenge him directly. Maya remained calm. She had watched this pattern unfold countless times throughout her career. Sometimes people became so focused on their own narrative that they stopped paying attention to information that contradicted it. That was often when mistakes became expensive. Across the table, the older board member finally leaned toward the executive seated beside him and quietly showed him a page from the document he had been studying. The executive's eyes widened. He looked toward Maya almost immediately. A few moments later, another executive received the same document. The reaction was nearly identical. No one said anything out loud, but a silent chain reaction had begun. Recognition was spreading through the room, one person at a time. Richard remained completely unaware. He continued discussing future growth plans, unaware that attention was no longer focused entirely on his presentation. Increasingly, people were studying Maya. Not because she was demanding attention. Not because she was speaking loudly. Simply because evidence was beginning to contradict the assumptions made about her. And the more those assumptions unraveled, the more dangerous Richard's position became. For the first time all day, the room was no longer asking who Maya was. The room was beginning to ask why Richard did not seem to know. The afternoon session began with what Richard described as the most important segment of the day. The presentation screen shifted to financial commitments, implementation schedules, and long-term projections. This was the section everyone had been building toward for hours. If the company secured the support it expected, the expansion plan could move forward almost immediately. Richard stood confidently at the front of the room and spoke as though the outcome had already been decided. His certainty remained unchanged, but the room around him was no longer the same room that had existed that morning. More and more executives had quietly connected the dots. Several had reviewed background materials during the break. Others had searched internal reports and partnership documents. The name Brooks Capital appeared repeatedly. Market analysis, risk assessments, strategic recommendations. Some of the most valuable insights supporting the company's growth strategy traced back to the same source. Yet Richard continued speaking as though none of that mattered. Maya sat quietly listening. Her expression remained calm and unreadable. She had not corrected anyone. She had not introduced herself beyond the basic courtesy required when she arrived. She had simply allowed people to reveal their assumptions. Now those assumptions were beginning to collide with reality. As Richard moved through another set of slides, he highlighted projected revenue growth over the next 5 years. The numbers were impressive. Several executives nodded in approval. Then one board member raised a question about investor confidence. Have all major stakeholders reviewed the final structure? He asked. It was a simple question, but Maya noticed several people immediately glance in her direction. Richard either missed it or chose to ignore it. We have received overwhelmingly positive feedback, he replied. There is every reason to move forward. The answer seemed to satisfy him more than anyone else. A few moments later, another executive asked whether additional investor consultations would be required before implementation. Richard smiled confidently. Nothing significant remains, he said. We are essentially at the finish line. This time, silence followed. Not agreement. Silence. The kind of silence that appears when people know something important but are waiting for the right moment to speak. Maya could feel the shift. The mystery surrounding her presence was fading. Recognition was replacing speculation. At the far end of the table, the older board member finally closed his folder and folded his hands. His expression suggested he had reached a conclusion. Beside him, another executive appeared equally certain. Neither interrupted the meeting. Neither challenged Richard. They simply watched. Richard continued presenting future milestones and expected funding schedules. Every forecast assumed stability. Every timeline assumed approval. Every projection assumed trust. Yet with each passing minute, the foundation beneath those assumptions became weaker. The most interesting part was that Richard still seemed completely unaware. He remained focused on the screen, on the numbers, on the vision he was selling. He never noticed that attention was drifting away from the presentation itself. Increasingly, people were watching Maya. Not because she had demanded influence. Not because she had claimed authority. They were watching because they had started to realize that the person Richard treated as the least important individual in the room might actually be the one person whose opinion mattered most. The conversation eventually arrived at the subject everyone had been circling for hours without directly naming: funding authorization. The presentation screen displayed a detailed implementation roadmap divided into phases, each dependent on capital being released at specific milestones. Richard stood beside the screen with complete confidence. He spoke as though every signature had already been collected and every decision had already been made. Once the commitment is finalized, we begin immediately, he said. Construction, hiring, technology deployment, everything moves forward on schedule. Several executives nodded, but their attention was no longer fixed on the presentation. Maya could see it in their faces. They were listening, yet they were also waiting. The room had become a place of unspoken questions. One executive reviewed a document for the third time. Another quietly checked figures on a tablet. At the far end of the table, the older board member exchanged a brief glance with a colleague. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The realization that had started spreading earlier was now moving through the room with increasing speed. Then an unexpected moment shifted the atmosphere again. A senior finance executive referenced a due diligence report that had been instrumental in securing support for the expansion strategy. The recommendations from Brooks Capital significantly improved our risk position, he explained. Several vulnerabilities were identified before they became serious concerns. This time nobody ignored the statement. Several heads turned toward Maya almost instinctively. Richard continued studying the screen. If he noticed the reaction, he gave no indication. That analysis was helpful, he said casually. Our team incorporated the strongest elements. Maya remained silent. She had no interest in claiming credit. The truth did not need assistance. It simply needed time. The finance executive hesitated for a moment as if considering whether to add something else. Eventually, he decided against it. Still, the damage to Richard's assumptions had already begun. More people were connecting the dots. More people were beginning to understand why Maya had never seemed concerned about being overlooked. Confidence rooted in status often demands recognition. Confidence rooted in competence does not. As the discussion continued, Richard invited comments from around the table. Department heads offered updates. Advisors shared observations. Board members raised concerns. Yet somehow Maya remained the one person whose perspective was never directly requested. By now, the omission was impossible to miss. Even those who had stayed silent throughout the day appeared increasingly uncomfortable. One executive finally looked toward Maya and asked, "Do you have any thoughts on the implementation schedule?" Before she could answer, Richard stepped in. "We have already covered the major points," he said. "I think we are ready to move forward." The interruption hung in the air. Nobody responded immediately. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before. It was no longer uncertainty. It was recognition. Around the table, people were beginning to understand that the most important voice in the room had been repeatedly ignored. The only person who still seemed unaware of that fact was Richard himself. The silence after Richard interrupted the question lingered longer than anyone expected. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Earlier in the day, people had accepted his control of the conversation without hesitation. Now the room seemed reluctant to move forward. Several executives shifted in their seats. Others exchanged quick glances. Something fundamental had changed. The confidence that had carried the meeting all morning was beginning to encounter resistance. Not open resistance. Careful resistance. The kind that emerges when experienced people realize they may not have the full picture. Richard appeared unaware of it. He advanced to the next slide and continued outlining implementation milestones. The opportunity before us is extraordinary, he said. Once final approval is complete, we will be positioned for unprecedented growth. Maya listened quietly. Her notebook remained closed. Her hands rested calmly on the table. She had not spoken in nearly an hour. Yet somehow her presence felt larger than ever. The older board member finally decided to speak. Before we move to approval discussions, he said carefully, perhaps we should hear from everyone in attendance. The suggestion sounded routine, reasonable, professional, but the room immediately understood its significance. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. I believe the major perspectives have already been covered, he replied. We have a strong consensus. Nobody responded. The silence returned. This time it felt heavier. Across the table, a senior executive who had remained mostly quiet throughout the day cleared his throat. I would actually be interested in hearing additional views, he said, especially from stakeholders who have been involved in evaluating the long-term risk profile. Several heads nodded. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal agreement. Maya noticed something interesting. Nobody was looking at Richard anymore. They were looking at one another. The center of gravity in the room was shifting. Authority was no longer flowing in a single direction. It was beginning to disperse. Richard forced a smile and continued reviewing the agenda. There will be opportunities for follow-up conversations, he said. For now, I would like to keep us focused on execution. The response only increased the tension. More executives began reviewing documents. Some looked toward Maya openly now. Others seemed to be waiting for someone else to say what everyone was already thinking. Then a board member near the far end of the table spoke up. Out of curiosity, he said, looking directly at Maya, how long have you been involved with this project? The question immediately captured the room's attention. For the first time all day, someone had addressed her directly without interruption. Maya met his gaze and answered calmly. Since the earliest evaluation phase. The response was simple, honest. Yet it had a powerful effect. Several people looked surprised. A few appeared to be mentally recalculating everything they thought they knew. Richard quickly stepped back into the conversation. Well, he said with a light laugh, a lot of people have contributed along the way. But the comment landed differently than it might have earlier that morning. The room was no longer accepting assumptions at face value. Questions were forming. Connections were becoming clearer. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard seemed to sense that something was happening around him that he did not fully understand. For the first time that day, Richard stopped speaking before he had finished a thought. It was only a brief pause, barely noticeable to someone unfamiliar with him, but everyone in the room felt it. The atmosphere had shifted beyond his control. Questions that had quietly accumulated throughout the meeting were now impossible to ignore. The older board member leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. I think it would be helpful, he said calmly, if we formally introduced everyone involved in the approval process. Several people nodded immediately. No one objected. Richard forced a polite smile. Of course, he replied. Although I believe everyone already understands the structure. The statement sounded less convincing than he intended. One by one, people briefly described their roles. Department heads, legal advisors, board members, senior executives. The introductions moved around the room until only Maya remained. A quiet anticipation settled over the table. Richard glanced toward her for a moment, then looked away. It was clear he expected a routine answer. Maya sat calmly, exactly as she had all day. My name is Maya Brooks, she said. I am the managing partner of Brooks Capital. The room became completely silent. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody shuffled papers. The silence was immediate and absolute. Maya continued speaking in the same calm tone. For the past 8 months, my team has led the evaluation process for this opportunity. We conducted the market analysis, the risk assessments, the financial reviews, and the governance recommendations referenced throughout today's presentations. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others stared directly at Richard. The older board member simply nodded, as though confirming what he had already discovered hours earlier. Maya continued. Brooks Capital currently serves as the lead decision authority for the investment consortium supporting this proposal. Richard blinked. The confidence that had carried him through the entire meeting seemed to disappear all at once. I see, he said quietly. It was the first time all day he sounded uncertain. Maya offered a professional smile. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass anyone, just calm professionalism. I attempted to contribute several times during today's discussion, she said, primarily regarding risk management, contingency planning, and deployment structure. Those are areas my team spent considerable time evaluating. Nobody in the room missed the meaning behind the statement. Every interruption, every dismissal, every ignored question suddenly looked different. Executives who had witnessed the interactions throughout the day now understood exactly what had happened. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time since the meeting began, he appeared uncomfortable. Maya opened her notebook and glanced at a page she had written earlier. This opportunity remains significant, she said. However, our firm places considerable value on leadership judgment, decision-making discipline, and stakeholder engagement. Those factors are as important to us as financial performance. The words were measured and respectful, but their impact was unmistakable. Around the table, people understood that the conversation was no longer about projections, expansion plans, or future revenue. It was about trust. And for the first time all day, Richard realized that the person he had treated as the least important voice in the room had actually been the one person whose confidence he could not afford to lose. The room remained silent after Maya finished speaking. The silence felt different now. Earlier, it had been filled with uncertainty. Now it was filled with understanding. Every executive at the table could replay the day in their mind and see exactly what had happened. The questions that had been dismissed. The observations that had been ignored. The expertise that had been overlooked. Richard sat motionless for a moment, searching for the right response. Maya, he began carefully, if there has been any misunderstanding today, I would like to address it. Maya met his gaze without hostility. I appreciate that, she replied. However, this is not about a misunderstanding. It is about judgment. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Richard straightened in his chair. Our company values every stakeholder involved in this process, he said. I hope that has been clear. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. The statement sounded reasonable, but it conflicted with everything they had witnessed throughout the day. Maya nodded politely. Values are important, she said. But investors do not evaluate organizations based on statements. We evaluate them based on behavior. The words landed with remarkable force precisely because they were delivered so calmly. Maya opened her notebook one final time. Over the past 8 months, Brooks Capital has invested significant resources evaluating this opportunity. We believed the business fundamentals were strong. We believed the market opportunity was real. We believed the company had the potential to achieve impressive results. Richard listened carefully. For a brief moment, hope seemed to return to his expression. Then Maya continued. But leadership matters. The room became completely still again. Leadership influences culture. Leadership influences decision-making. Leadership determines whether organizations listen to important perspectives or simply reward familiar voices. Nobody moved. The city skyline beyond the windows seemed frozen. Maya closed her notebook and placed both hands calmly on the table. After reviewing today's meeting, I no longer have sufficient confidence in the leadership judgment required to support this investment at the level previously discussed. Several executives inhaled sharply. Even those who suspected what was coming appeared stunned when they heard the words spoken aloud. Richard's face lost color. "Are you saying?" Maya answered before he could finish. "Brooks Capital will be withdrawing its participation from the proposed commitment." No anger. No dramatic speech. No raised voice. Just a simple decision delivered with complete certainty. The impact was immediate. The number everyone had been assuming was secure suddenly became uncertain. The foundation beneath the expansion plan shifted in an instant. Executives looked at one another. Some stared at the presentation screen. Others lowered their eyes to the documents in front of them. Richard seemed unable to speak for several seconds. The confidence that had defined him all day had disappeared completely. Maya remained professional. "This decision was not made lightly," she said. "Our responsibility is to allocate capital where we have confidence not only in strategy, but also in leadership." Today provided information that we could not ignore. The room understood exactly what she meant. The consequences were not the result of one mistake. They were the result of a pattern. A pattern everyone had watched unfold from the moment the meeting began. No one spoke immediately after Maya's announcement. The presentation screens were still displaying ambitious growth projections, expansion schedules, and revenue forecasts, but they suddenly felt disconnected from reality. Plans that had seemed certain only minutes earlier now appeared fragile. The assumptions supporting them had changed. The room understood that. Richard understood it too. The difference was that everyone else had seen it coming. Richard had not. He finally leaned forward. "Is there an opportunity to continue the conversation?" he asked. His voice remained professional, but the certainty that had defined him throughout the day was gone. Maya considered the question carefully before responding. "Conversations are always possible," she said. "Trust is more difficult." Nobody challenged the statement. Several board members looked down at their notes. Others stared through the windows overlooking the city. The consequences of what had just happened were spreading through everyone's mind. Without the expected commitment, timelines would need revision. Expansion targets would require reevaluation. Strategic assumptions would need to be reconsidered. The issue was larger than a single funding source. The issue was confidence. One executive from finance quietly reviewed projected cash flow schedules. Another began making notes in the margin of a presentation packet. The atmosphere had shifted from celebration to assessment. Not panic. Assessment. Experienced professionals understood that business challenges could be solved. What concerned them was the reason this challenge existed in the first place. The older board member finally spoke. "Leadership decisions have consequences," he said calmly. It was not directed at anyone specifically, yet everyone knew who he meant. Richard remained silent. For perhaps the first time that day, he appeared willing to listen rather than speak. Maya gathered her notebook and organized a few papers in front of her. Her movements were calm and unhurried. There was no sense of victory in her behavior. No desire to make the moment more painful than it already was. She had simply reached a conclusion and acted accordingly. Around the table, several executives seemed to respect that restraint. One of them finally addressed Maya directly. "Was the decision based entirely on today's meeting?" he asked. Maya shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "The business opportunity remains attractive. The market opportunity remains attractive. What changed today was my understanding of how critical perspectives are treated when they come from unexpected sources." The room became quiet once again. The statement forced everyone to reflect on what they had witnessed. Richard had not ignored Maya once. He had ignored her repeatedly. The pattern mattered. The consistency mattered. The assumptions behind those choices mattered. Another executive nodded slowly as though reaching the same conclusion. The company's challenge was no longer financial. It was cultural. Trust in leadership had become part of the discussion. And once that happens, numbers alone cannot solve the problem. Richard looked toward Maya. "I regret how this unfolded," he said. The statement appeared sincere. Maya acknowledged it with a small nod. "I appreciate that," she replied. "Every leader makes mistakes. The important question is whether they learn from them." No one spoke after that. The lesson was already sitting in front of them. Visible. Unavoidable. more powerful than anything displayed on the presentation screens. And for the first time all day, the room seemed focused on the lesson rather than the deal. The meeting ended very differently from the way it had begun. Hours earlier, people had entered the boardroom expecting to celebrate a major milestone. Now they were leaving with something far more valuable than a business agreement. They were leaving with a lesson. Maya stood and gathered her notebook. The same notebook she had carried into the building that morning. The same notebook many people had overlooked. Around the table, several executives rose from their seats. A few approached her personally. Some thanked her for her honesty. Others expressed respect for the professionalism she had demonstrated throughout the day. None of those conversations were long. They did not need to be. The most important things had already been said. Richard remained seated for a moment after everyone else began preparing to leave. He looked around the room as though seeing it differently for the first time. The presentations were still displayed on the screens. The projections were still impressive. The opportunity still existed. Yet something fundamental had changed. He finally stood and walked toward Maya. The room grew quiet again. Not because people expected conflict. They expected something else. Reflection. Richard stopped a few feet away. I have spent my career believing I could evaluate people quickly, he said. Today proved that I was wrong. Maya listened without interrupting. I made assumptions, he continued. And those assumptions affected my decisions. For the first time all day, there was no defensiveness in his voice. No attempt to justify anything. Only honesty. Maya nodded. Every person makes assumptions, she said. The difference is whether we are willing to confront them when they become visible. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. Then he thanked her. Not for the investment opportunity. Not for the analysis. For the lesson. It was perhaps the most sincere thing he had said all day. Maya accepted the gratitude with grace. Then she turned toward the doors. As she walked through the boardroom, people moved aside naturally. Not because of her title. Not because of the capital she controlled. Not because of the decision she had made. They moved aside because respect had finally replaced assumption. Outside the conference room, the late afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass walls of the building. Employees continued moving through hallways. Phones continued ringing. Meetings continued taking place. The world had not stopped. Yet for the people inside that boardroom, something important had changed. Maya stepped into the elevator and watched the doors slowly close. She felt no satisfaction in the outcome. Real leadership was not about proving someone wrong. Real leadership was about recognizing truth when it appeared. Sometimes that truth arrived in the form of data. Sometimes it arrived in the form of experience. And sometimes it arrived in the form of a person everyone had underestimated. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, one thought remained clear. The most expensive mistakes in business are rarely found in spreadsheets. They are found in assumptions. Assumptions about who belongs. Assumptions about who matters. Assumptions about who deserves to be heard. The people who succeed over the long term understand something simple. Respect should never be based on appearance, status, background, or expectation. Because the quietest person in the room may be the wisest voice in the room. And the person you choose to ignore today may be the person whose trust determines your future tomorrow.